Has God really got hold of this situation that I'm concerned with? Is it really in the palm of God's hand? Is there something I should be doing to, be the hands and feet of Christ in the world that I'm not doing yet? So even as one can be faithful, one can also be doubtful. And neither of those things making anyone more or less loved in the eyes of God. Any thoughts or any things that you see, and they need not be quite as, quite as deep. They can be simply, but the things that one is wrestling with, or the things that one comes up against, that do not necessarily seem to match. I let you all, like Mary, treasure those things in your heart. And again, it's a good praying question. Not to try and solve the things, not to try and, bash them down as soon as you find them, but just to say, look at that. Isn't that interesting? In the same way as we look at God and say, isn't it interesting that God can be steadfast and new every morning at the same time? And so, as we come to spend some time with this as a companion for this season of Epiphany, it occurs to me that it's worth just a little nod, and this might be a little opening as well, to the role that St. Benedict plays in the sort of the deep waters out of which this thinking and writing comes. Because as I mentioned to you all at the beginning, Joan Chittister is a Benedictine nun. She lives in Pennsylvania. And as I mentioned, when we kicked off, I think she is a fabulous writer and teacher, not just for the quality of her thought, but the way that she conveys it and the way that she does it in this manner that is so loving and with such kinship that I think really speaks to the way that she looks at Christ and the way that she tries to live that out. That when she writes and when she speaks, she's not lecturing at somebody, but she's talking with them and she's walking with them. And so Benedict of Nursia is, because that's where he was living when all the exciting things in his life kicked off. He is from days of old. He was living between 480 and somewhere around 547. And he, as you all may have heard at some point, he's basically sort of the forebear of all monastic life. So all nuns and all monks in the Christian Western tradition, even Eastern to some extent, they all kind of draw from what he started, because back in the day he wrote a very short little pamphlet called The Rule, like the Guidelines of St. Benedict, which we call it now, and it's like 9,000 words. You could read it in one sitting. It's really not a hefty document in terms of bashing through it, and yet it has been profoundly impactful on the way that lots of people live even now, and including the author of this book. And I would draw your gaze as we sort of embark on this trajectory to what are in fact the vows for people who want to commit to a certain kind of life guided by this very old, very deeply rooted way of serving and relating to and being with God. Because I think you will see that it's related to this track that we're on of looking at the contradictions and finding God in them. So the three things that you vow, or that you make professions of, are stability, conversion of life, and obedience. And stability, to start with, it can mean, and it does, for many, monks and nuns, it means you're going to be in the physical, geographic place, in that monastery, or at least with that community, for your life. That's the vow of stability that you're making. You're not going to go elsewhere. The monastery may move, in which case you'll go with it, but your stability is very tangibly linked to that place and those people. So you may say, well, what on earth does that have to do with me? Because I have, many of us, right, we don't live in the house that we were born in. We have definitely moved around, and likely we shall be doing that for a while yet, or we shall at least not be committing to a certain place and a certain group of people for all time. So stability, what it invites us to think of in ourselves, is an invitation to be exactly where we are, to not run away from what is happening in our life or what God is doing in it, whether it's on a personal level, whether it's our relationship with other people, whether it's the large questions of what on earth we're called to do in the state of this country or the world. The stability of staying put in that moment, in that place, and really showing up. And that takes a lot more focus and a lot more grace than it seems sometimes. So stability in even being able to have an honest reckoning of what's really happening, what's really going on. With us, with people we love, with the world. Instead of turning on the TV, going onto Facebook. I mean, you can still do those things, but having the desire to stay put for a moment and see what God is saying and what God's doing. And at the same time, and here's where the contradiction comes in, it's a vow to a conversion of life. Which means that at the same time as you are staying put and you are rooted and you are not running away and you're not being distracted or looking for distractions, at the same time in that rootedness, you are open to changing. You are not stable to the point that you're rigid, but you are open to what God is going to do in you and how God is going to show up and how that might make things look a little different from the perspective that we've had or that we hold. How it might trouble things that we thought, you know what, this is just me. This is just who I am. God may have different ideas, and God is never done with us. And God is always showing up to help us grow. So even that is a strange, strange thing, to think that you could be rooted and anchored in your relationship with God, that you could be present in the moment, that you could face the things that I, for one, find it easier oftentimes to dash away from, that you could do that and at the same time have this little bit of flex so that when God goes to move my heart or my mind, it can actually take that guidance and it can actually move. And finally is a vow of obedience, and that is a vow to listen. That's exactly what that word means. It's just to hear. It's a vow to listen to God in whatever way God shows up. It could be a thought, it could be a word, it could be a sight. But this vow to be open to hearing what God has to say, when God has to say it, that's the third kind of promise that people, whether they're monks or they're people like you and me, that's what they are promising to try and do with God's help and God's grace. And so I invite you to to have this book as a companion. It's the beauty of it, besides that table of contents I showed you, is that if you look at any of these chapters, the printing is generous, which is good for all of us, but the chapters are between, I'd say, something like 6 and 8 pages. I know, David's already excited. He says, I've got this. But there, and again, I think it is testament to the heart of the writer. It is not overly wordy prose. It is not the kind of stuff that you say, I need to be awake to a certain extent, otherwise 3 of these pages are going to go over my head. It is the kind of thing you can take a bite of, and you can chew it over, and you can live your life, and you can start to see, oh, I recognize that because I saw it, I heard about it somewhere, and I've been looking for it. Because somehow just reading about some of these things can attune you to seeing how God is showing up in those ways, even when you're not even thinking about it. And I would also commend it to you because I do believe you can pop around. It's not a sequential thing. It's not like you have to start at chapter 1 and then you have to work your way through. If you see something that speaks to the condition of your soul, or that seems to be particularly resonant, you go and read it. You go and see what it has to offer, and don't worry that you haven't read all the 13 bits before it. And I think what is life-giving to me is that I find in my own life the act of reading such a book as this, of having such a companion as this, is that I find it builds in me those 3 things. Other stuff too, but those 3 very things. That when I'm reading this, and when I trust the person writing it, and I trust that I'm not about to get smacked over the head by something extremely judgmental or unkind, I can actually show up in the moment, and I can actually look at things that I might not want to do otherwise if I were on my own. I can face things that I know to be true, but I often run away from. And so texts like this can be an aid to me in being more present to God. They can be a support to me in saying, not only then do I stand and I see what is true, but I also then am invited into a new way of looking at things. And something that's going to be on me to do in response. And finally, I think that reading this kind of a text can be in its own self an act of listening to God. Especially when one wonders sometimes, well, what does it mean to listen to God? How do I do that? One of the ways can be spending time listening to see what God is saying through one of God's saints, one of God's children, in their own words, through them. And so, in the last little bit of our time, I've given you just a snippet at the bottom of this page from the book. It's from chapter 8, and it's one of the things that I remembered later on. And when I came to think, what is one of the examples that spoke so profoundly to me? This is the one that came to mind. And I went back to find it, and I would say that this gives you a taste of this companionship and also this way of showing up in the moment and thinking about what is not necessarily appealing or necessarily the most recreational way to spend one's free time, but what is life-giving, what is invitational in its way of calling us or me to think differently, and finally, what can be, just by reading it, an act of listening to God. And it's from a chapter that's called The Poverty of Plenty. And Joan Chittister writes, "The poverty of plenty is a state of mind where enough is never enough. It is an agonizing situation to be in. things that you'd like to share at the brink of this new year and this new season of Epiphany? Well, I commend the coffee to you. I commend John Chichester. I believe it's 15. And you know where we are. So if you want to purchase a book today, please feel free to do so. If you don't have the funds, feel free also to take a book with you and bring them another time. But thank you so much for spending the morning with me. And God bless for being happy.